Nope, let's try to answer as many questions. We'll endeavor to answer as many questions as we can throughout and at the end of the webinar. And we do have a SHRM certification number for today for 1.0 in continuing education credits. HRCI is not very cooperative when we try and get that from HRCI. I'm sorry for those of you who would like that too, but we do have a SHRM PDC credit that I can give you if you reach out to me later. So joining me today is Karen Whitley. Karen is an attorney and also a shareholder at Sheehan Phinney's Employment Law Group, where her practice focuses on management side employment litigation, compliance, and counseling, including discrimination, wage and hour, and restrictive covenant proceedings. She values working closely with HR professionals and in-house counsel to develop a practical business approach to complex employment law issues. And we all know Karen, as well as many other people at Sheehan Phinney, well, because we get a lot of information from them and stay close to them all the time. So welcome today, Karen. Thanks for being with us.
It's great to be here, and I am sorry that this is not going to be, first of all, I don't have a crystal ball, wish I did, and that, we planned this thinking that maybe we were going to be really cutting edge and have brand new guidance, and you would hear it here first. So hopefully what you hear today will be helpful to help you get started and thinking about some of the issues. And I'm very happy to join you all today.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Yeah, I mean, again, no one has this crystal ball, but we just really felt by now. In fact, all of you on this, we were deciding, should we do this a week? Should we have done this a week earlier? Because what is already going to be old, but nothing's old yet. So let's go ahead and get started. So, Karen, what do you think is the holdup with getting this guidance out to us? What's taking so long?
I actually think it's not all that surprising that it's taken so long. And I think there's really 4 reasons that I'm happy to go through. One is the process itself takes time. And then there's also some legal standards that have to be met. They're probably anticipating a lot of the questions and legal challenges. And there's just a lot to coordinate. So really to kind of break that down, the process itself takes time because what we're waiting for here is an ETS, Emergency Temporary Standard, from OSHA. So that's what President Biden, when he spoke about the path out of the pandemic on September 9th and mentioned this ETS that would be put out by OSHA to apply to employers with 100 employees or more. It is basically, some people are calling it, a workaround around the normal rulemaking process. And OSHA puts out workplace standards, but those changes, if you go through the normal process, can take a very long time, can take years. Any rulemaking can take years. So this method is a way to have an emergency temporary rule in place for 6 months. And then the expectation is that within the 6-month period, there would be more information provided, and then perhaps the rule would, if it survives, would become a permanent standard. So because of just the process, although it's emergency, it does take some time. And we should keep in mind that I believe in January, President Biden started talking about the importance of protocols and really trying to stamp out COVID-19, but it took until June for the OSHA to put out an ETS relating just to healthcare. So that took a good amount of time to come out. So I will refer to that ETS that was put out in June. It was just for healthcare employers.
Right.
So even though it did not mandate vaccines, it has some helpful things that we'll refer to later in this conversation. But in terms of timing, we know that the draft rule was sent to the White House by OSHA on October 12th, so a week ago. The thought was, it could be issued as soon as Friday or Monday. I'm hoping it doesn't get issued before 1 o'clock today, but it could come any minute. So that's the process. It's also probably taking time because there are some legal standards. So because it's this workaround of the normal rulemaking process, they don't want OSHA just out there saying we're going to, require employers to this, this, and this. There are some legal standards that have to be met, and one of them is that an ETS is only appropriate if there's a grave danger to employees in the workplace. And so OSHA will need to justify that there's a grave danger in the workplace. And keep in mind, the ETS we're talking about, the one that will apply to employers with 100 or more employees, will apply to all kinds of employers.
Mm.
And so there may be some employers like healthcare where they will be both over 100 employees and there'll be healthcare. And those healthcare workers are in a more vulnerable spot. They may actually be caring for COVID patients. They may have patients have visitors who are experiencing symptoms. So they may be much more exposed than a workplace with 100 or more employees, but spread out over a very large area. So it's going to be very interesting to see how OSHA characterizes this as a grave danger in the workplace, as opposed to a grave danger just as a matter of public health. So that could be another reason that they, have to go through that whole process to come up with to justify the grave danger part of it. The third reason I mentioned that it might be taking a long time is because of the need to anticipate legal challenges. And one of them could be, there's no grave danger in every single workplace of 100 or more employers, and yet you're imposing vaccination requirements on all employers over 100 employees. So there's going to be some need to anticipate that. And I would say, one of the final reason really is this coordination, the need to coordinate. Keep in mind that President Biden's path out of the pandemic goal plan had at least 6 different avenues. One was for federal contractors, and one was for healthcare, and one was for the 100 and more employees. And as I said, some employers may fall into more than one of those buckets. And in the healthcare setting, their Center for Medicare and Medicaid, CMS, is going to be coming up with its own guidance about vaccinating healthcare workers. So I understand that CMS and OSHA are coordinating, so they have to coordinate with one another. They have to sort of be thinking about what all the questions that are going to come up, because the other thing that happened in June when they put out the ETS for healthcare workers is they also put out a frequently asked questions document, which is really where I live. Under the FFCRA, I learned those FAQs, questions and answers, inside and out. That's where all my, the majority of my information was that I was able to give employees. They're very detailed, they're very helpful. They cover a number of different scenarios. And we would expect that because of the sensitivity of this and the scope of this, that they're also going to put out some FAQs. So all of that, the process, all that's covered, the scope of this, anticipating legal challenges, trying to avoid that. I am not surprised that it's taken this long.
No kidding. Well,
Yeah.
For the employees that have federal contracts or considered federal contractors, are they already supposed to be following this mandate?
They are supposed to be following the executive order. So there was an executive order issued in September that applied to federal contractors, employees of federal contractors. And so I have a number of clients that were going through that process probably 2-3 weeks ago, where they were having to communicate, especially subcontractors, that they have to communicate with their employees to say, we have 6 projects and 2 of them are federal contracts. So anybody working on that has to be vaccinated. But the executive order was even broader. If those people had any contact in the company with people who were not working on federal contracts, those people also had to be vaccinated. So it was a very broad thing. So the rule was put in place, but those people have until November 22nd to be vaccinated. So there is some good news. And I know we're going to talk about the timing of this, but
yeah, it's till November 22nd. So does that mean fully vaccinated, the dose 1 and 2 plus the 2 weeks after?
Right.
Has to be done by then?
Right. For the federal contractors. Yes. Right.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Got it. Okay. Well, so once the guidelines do come out, how much time will people have to implement them? Do they give them like 30 days, 60 days? I mean, they can't say, all right, starting tomorrow, you got to implement this. Do they?
Right. So, oh, and somebody just said federal employees November 22nd and contractors December 8th. That's exactly right. Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm lumping everybody together. My clients
Yes.
were freaking out, shall we put it?
Mildly.
Because there were some people that, that were very, very adamantly opposed. So they got to jump on this and wanted to make sure they met the most conservative deadline. So you're absolutely right. There are two separate dates for that. So the question again was how much time? So
Yeah, how much time to get it implemented?
right. So in many states, a federal OSHA rule will take effect immediately. There are several states, not Maine, Massachusetts, or New Hampshire, but other states that don't follow federal. They have a state OSHA plan. So federal, it is likely that when the ETS comes out, it will take effect immediately in the majority of states. Some states that have state OSHA, it will take effect within 15 to 30 days after that. But saying that the ETS takes effect is different from saying this is the deadline by which you must be vaccinated.
Ah,
So the rule will take effect, and then the
okay.
rule will have a period of time to comply with it.
Mhm.
If we look back at the healthcare ETS issued in June, it took effect immediately, but it gave, I think, between 15 and 30 days for certain of the requirements in that. Again, the healthcare ETS did not require vaccines,
Mhm.
but it did require things like paid leave and various PPE and things like that. So
Mhm.
the rule may take effect, but there will be a rollout process. And we don't
Okay.
know what that rollout process will be. We don't know whether it will be consistent with the length of time that federal employees and federal contractors had to roll out those programs.
Mhm.
We just don't know. Obviously the goal of the administration is to ramp up vaccinations as soon as possible. But that brings another question.
Right.
These ETS, these standards may be rolled out and they may have an implementation timeframe. But we already know that they're going to be subject to legal challenge.
Mhm.
And we also know that ETS is the ETS in the history of OSHA rolling out ETS, the majority of them, when they're challenged, do not pass legal muster. So it is possible that OSHA could issue the ETS. There's already one state, and there's probably more, but I know that within a week, Arizona filed a lawsuit to stop implementation. And if any of these states or interest groups or employer groups file a lawsuit, and if they ask for an injunction and the injunction stops implementation of the rule across the country, which more judges in the COVID era are willing to do,
Mhm.
it could mean that we've waited all this time for a standard that is almost immediately suspended. So we don't
Okay.
know how that's gonna play out.
So there is a chance it could be suspended based on a federal injunction as well.
It could
Okay.
be. The
Okay.
hope is, I think, that even it will take some time for that an injunction to happen, and that in the meantime, the threat of this or the period of time where it's actually in effect could be enough for some employers to require their employees in the meantime, because employers can
Mhm.
always do this on their own.
Sure.
So might be requiring, convincing employers to take that step. And I think that some time there have been employers who would have wanted to do a mandate or were interested in a mandate, but didn't want to be exposed by being the first or the only one to do this.
Mhm.
So this gives them some backbone to say,
Right.
hey, this is what we're supposed to be doing. So
Right.
it's
Right.
unclear. This may be stopped in its tracks, but it may have an impact in getting some people on board.
It could, it could. How about the 100 plus employee threshold? How's that normally decided? Is it company wide? Is it state by state? Does it include if you have any foreign placed employees?
Yeah, there's a number of different definitions. We don't know what definition is going to be used.
Okay.
We can probably be pretty sure that it's going to be all employees on an employer's payroll. And we can probably be pretty sure that it's going to just be the ones in the US.
Okay.
We don't often see that they look abroad. But I pulled up the definition of employer in the FFCRA, because that's one of the more recent.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a Department of Labor definition, and it is very broad. That was where, remember, the FFCRA, which was in place from April 1st, 2020 through December 31st of
Right.
2020. And it allowed, and then it was extended, or it was voluntarily extended. It applied to employers with 500 or fewer employees. And so the definition there was all full-time and part-time employees within the United States, within the United States or any territory, including any employees on leave, any temporary employees jointly employed by another employer. So if you have two companies and there's some sort of common management or affiliated companies, all of those employees would be added together. And interestingly, any day laborers supplied by a temporary agency. So it could be as broad as not just looking at who's on your payroll, but who is working for you on a consistent basis.
Mm-hmm.
Or people who are not working for you on a consistent basis because they're on a leave of absence, but they're associated with your company. So we don't know how broad, if the goal is to capture as many employers as possible, the definition of employees employed by the employer is going to be as broad as possible to capture as many companies. So
Probably so. Okay.
yeah, so we don't know. That's where the crystal ball would be helpful, but it's one of the pieces of homework is to be figuring out, could this apply to you? If you're a 20-person company, I don't think you're going to have any qualms about this.
Right. Probably
Those
not have to
people on
worry
the
about it.
fringe or associated with other companies should be thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, how about if a group of your employees are 100% remote, they've always been remote, will those remote employees be exempt from having to be vaccinated?
So that's an area that we're going to have to, I expect we will see clarification. We will see that actually covered. The ETS for healthcare did say that remote workers, even 100% remote workers, were covered. I don't know whether OSHA is going to say, but healthcare is in a category all its own, the degree of risk, the vulnerable populations at issue, that people with many comorbidities in the healthcare setting, as patients, that we need to make extra certain that anybody who has a connection to that healthcare facility, even if they're working remotely, because they could come in one day, I guess.
Right.
But the ETS for healthcare does say remote workers were covered by that. So whether that will be the case, because now we're talking about other employers,
Mm-hmm.
not in healthcare necessarily, and we are also talking about a vaccine mandate, which the healthcare ETS did not.
Mm-hmm. And should employers create a policy around mandatory vaccinations once the guidelines come out as well to institutionalize it within their own policies?
That's going to be very, very strongly recommended. And there's a number of policies that they will need to look at. It will not only be what are the requirements for vaccination, but about testing if they don't get vaccinated, right? Because there's an option to have testing instead. And there's been some debate about that. Is testing once a week, which is what was in the path to the pandemic announcement, is that enough, right? Is really testing somebody once a week going to be sufficient to reduce the grave danger in the workplace? Remember, that's what this ETS is supposed to do. So is it really okay for somebody to go into work having been tested 7 days ago? So, there'll be a lot of there'll be a lot of policies around that people have to be thinking of, and hopefully when the ETS comes out, I don't know that there will be any type of model policy put out, but
Mm,
I do know, for example, that when the federal contractor guidance came out, that the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force put out a frequently asked questions document for federal employers and contractors. And they did include, for example, two templates, one for medical accommodations and one for religious accommodations. So
okay.
it's possible that there's some forms that, could be helpful to employers that will be floated.
Okay. Are any of your clients doing testing now for their employees? How are they managing that? Are they sending them off site? Are they having on-site testing? What are they doing?
I would say the employers that I know that are mandating it are largely in healthcare settings.
Ah,
And
okay.
they've largely done it because of the degree of risk and the
Sure.
danger in the workplace. So they have we have long-term care facilities, assisted living facilities, nursing homes, and healthcare agencies, home health VNAs. Those are mostly the clients that I'm working with that are mandating vaccine. And some of that is because that's sort of what's coming down the pike at them and what has been
Sure.
already put in place. But the way that they're handling it, most of them are able to do vaccines on site,
Mm,
and they're also able to do testing on site.
mhm.
But obviously that's not going to be the case in large part. It probably won't be the case for the employers we're talking about, the
Right.
private employers with 100 or more employees. So
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And there've been quite a few questions around employers, whether they should survey and track their employees' vaccination status. Can you speak to the pros and cons of that? And if what is protected health information, if any, related to that?
it is going to be, I would think, a requirement that employers track that
Track it.
information.
Hmm.
And I know many employers already have been doing that, maybe not as formally as they will now need to, but they have been doing that. People got sick of wearing masks. People got sick of, in New Hampshire, there was the, having to take the temperature every day. That kind of went away, I
Right.
think in April, but there was, there was fatigue. And so employers were saying, okay, now we have the vaccine. Maybe we can let our guard down a little bit if we know what percentage of our folks are vaccinated. So employers have been keeping track of that, and we've been dealing with tons of questions about what do employees need to give, and who can have that information, and what happens if somebody won't get vaccinated, but we don't have a mandate. How do we handle that? So
Right.
we've absolutely been working with a lot of folks on that, and really, I think the guidance has been find out. The EEOC has said that you can ask who is vaccinated, and you can ask whether someone's vaccinated, and you can ask for proof of that.
Okay.
The ETS for healthcare, I think it was, or maybe it was there is a guidance out there, and I'm maybe confusing mine, but there is, I think it was the Safer for federal employees, the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force did say in that guidance that federal agencies had to ask for documentation, even if employees had previously just attested or sent an email or said, hey, I got my second shot, I'm all good. So at least under the FAQs, the guidance with regard to federal employees and federal contractors, there is now a requirement that the employer ask for the information and that the employer get documentation. So in the form of a copy of the paper vaccination card, or a
Mhm.
copy of the electronic record, and that they keep track of that. What's very interesting is that there is also a requirement that the employee swear under the pains and penalties of perjury that the information is correct,
Okay.
which is elevating it to a whole new level.
Mhm.
Asking for somebody to say that they're not committing perjury by turning in this form.
Right.
My colleague Jim Reedy has had some situations where there's a question about whether an employee's vaccination card is legit.
Uh-huh.
Is it a fraudulent card? Has somebody
Mhm.
used some other family member's card or something? So it's going to be
I'm sure.
a continuing challenge for employers
Yeah.
to, we have to ask for this card, and now we have to look and make sure that it's the right person and make sure that it's not smudged and
Right, it looks legit, kind of
Right.
like when we look at I-9 documents, right? It looks
Exactly.
legitimate to us. So, we're
Right.
taking it in faith and we're recording it, that kind of thing, right?
Right.
Mhm.
Right. So, but it is, I found it to be very interesting that the employees were required to certify under pains and penalties of perjury that the information is true and correct.
Yeah.
I'm
Of
not
course.
sure whether that's going to happen in the ETS, whether that's a
Mhm.
different, whether that's going to be a different process, but I would certainly say that employers can and probably should include in some sort of document or policy that submitting incorrect, inaccurate, misleading information is a violation of company policy and
Got
could
it.
lead to discipline. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, you definitely want to cover yourself for sure.
right.
False documentation, absolutely. Good.
Right.
Yeah, that's good advice. There's also a lot of concern around costs related to
Mhm.
this, right? To testing, if you're going to weekly test, that kind of thing. Have you heard anything about whether the government's going to give any kind of tax credits around the cost of testing or anything like that to help employers with that?
So not in this specific context, right? We know that the FFCRA tax credits are now over.
Right.
So I haven't heard anything specific in this context, but what I can say is that the federal equivalent here did talk about I'm sorry, the healthcare ETS, and they both came out around the same time, and I read them and I
Right.
absorbed them all at the same time. So the healthcare ETS does talk about paying for testing and paid leave to kind of recuperate
Mm-hmm.
from any side effects.
Right.
And the healthcare ETS does say that reasonable sick time has to be given to the employee, right? And President Biden did say in his address about path out of the pandemic that he would expect the OSHA ETS to provide the paid leave time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we have from the ETS with regard to healthcare is that even though it wasn't mandating vaccinations, there was clearly an encouragement for vaccination. And the ETS does say that the employer must support vaccination by giving paid leave. And they said it would be reasonable paid leave to get the vaccine and to recover if the employers were to give 8 hours of paid leave per shot. So if you got a J&J, you just got the 8 hours. If you got the other two, you would have, it would be reasonable to give a total of 16 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But some employers may say, oh my gosh, now I have to give everybody another 16 hours of paid leave. The healthcare ETS did make clear that that could be from employee accrued time. So it wasn't necessarily going to be, in that instance, going to be new time from an employer.
Mm-hmm.
But keep in mind that this was for healthcare workers,
Right.
and there was no size, there were different types of facilities that were covered, but it wasn't 100 or more employees necessarily. It could be a smaller healthcare facility. What we're dealing with now is large employers, 100 or more employees.
Mm-hmm.
What remains to be seen is, will OSHA say employers have to give new paid leave like they did under FFCRA, but there's a tax credit? Or will they say they have to give up to 16 hours of paid leave plus that could come out of the employee's sick leave bank or personal time or vacation bank if they want to get paid. Or will this be all new time without any tax credit
Right.
because they're large employers? So again, very much up in the air,
Mhm.
but there is some precedent for paid leave, job protected leave to get the vaccine, to get time off to recover. And that could potentially come out of an already accrued bank of time.
How about paying for the cost of testing itself? That could be really expensive to employers.
Yep. So there's two things. One is the cost of testing, and I'll get to that in a minute. The other is the time that it takes to get the test, right? Because that in the healthcare ETS is a consideration that it's working time. If you offer it to employees during work time, you have to pay them for that time, right?
Mhm.
It's a employer requirement. They get it done during, the morning of every Wednesday, if they if they're getting the vaccine or if they're getting testing, all of those things probably going to be covered working time. So the cost of testing, the cost of the vaccine, I mean, I think there's no question that's covered by insurance, but cost of testing,
Right.
it may be covered something by the ETS. That may be something that is specifically stated. It may also depend on state law. And I can say that under New Hampshire state law, there is legislation that's been in place for a while that says employers cannot require employees to pay the cost of a medical test required for employment. And they can't require employees to pay for the cost of getting the proof or getting records of their medical history if it's required for employment. So we have been saying for a while that employers, if they're sending people out for testing, as a condition of letting them in the building,
Mhm.
that's a condition of employment. It's an employer required test. And that the employers should be paying not only for the time that takes to get that done, but also for the test itself. Some employers, like I said, the majority of the employers that I've sort of are further along down this road are mostly healthcare employers. So they do it in-house and it's not as big of a deal. But I was talking to somebody yesterday who has done a little bit of exploring about what it would take. And it's $150 a pop for a test.
Wow.
And if it's done once or twice a week, that adds up. So
it sure does.
Yeah, so we'll see how that is. And that's assuming it's a PCR test, right?
Right.
There is some discussion about the fact that right at around the same time, President Biden authorized, I think it was like $1 billion for the rapid at-home tests.
Right.
So it's possible that there'll be some sort of alternative and it would just be maybe it could be an at-home test. And if it's positive, then you have to go and do the next level, PCR test. So we'll wait and see how that all rolls out. But the other part of an ETS, or at least one consideration, it's not only supposed to address grave danger, like whatever the grave danger is, and make sure that what OSHA is recommending will actually reduce that grave danger, but it also has to be feasible for the employer to roll this out. And is it feasible for employers even if they have 100 and more employees, to say to their employees, you have to get vaccinated or you have to do weekly testing, and then they have to pay for that testing? At what point is that really not a winning solution for the employer?
Right.
It could be very costly depending on how many employees, stick to their guns and say, I'm not getting vaccinated, or have some sort of accommodation and have to get tested.
Sure could. Now, will the people that have exemptions either for health or for religious, will they have to be tested then, since they won't be being vaccinated?
Right. That would be
that
would be my understanding, right?
Okay. Got it. And I have another question about that in just a moment, but are you seeing many of your clients with fewer than 100 employees go ahead and put vaccination mandates into place?
Like I said, I think I've seen that mostly in the
Healthcare,
the
you're saying healthcare and
healthcare settings.
long-term,
Right.
that kind of thing. Mhm.
Right.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of others. I don't know that I've seen significant education and maybe
Yes,
some
yes.
peer pressure.
Encouragement, right?
And
Mhm.
obviously there's the idea of incentives, right? There were a lot of companies
Exactly.
that were giving out various types of incentives. So
Yeah.
mandate, no, not so much, but making it worth your while.
Mhm.
You know, can you attend the holiday party?
Yeah.
Can you, do this, go to this golf outing?
Yeah.
So there's lots of incentives that employers have been using short of a mandate.
Got it. So, another area that's been confusing to some of our clients, I'm sure yours also, is that the exemption around sincerely held religious beliefs. It's like,
Right.
what can you actually require someone who says, I have a sincerely held religious belief that exempts me from this? What can you get from them, or are you allowed to prove that? And can you deny it?
Right. So, as I mentioned, under the federal FAQs, there is an FAQ that talks about this, and we know in the healthcare ETS there also is. So we can expect that the ETS, about 100 and more employees, will allow for an exemption, and so that's good news for employees. It's very challenging for employers, right?
Yes.
It's more challenging with regard to the religious belief than I think the medical, because employers are used to dealing with medical notes and how to
Sure.
suss that out and the questions they can and can't ask. The religious belief part of this is one that is very challenging for employers, and there is not a lot of guidance.
Mm.
The EEOC has a couple of guidances, one about religious dress and garb that was put out several years ago, which is very helpful, like sort of explaining to employers the fact that religious beliefs don't necessarily need to be an established religion. And there can be an established religion, like one of the more well-known ones that has doctrines, where the head of that particular religion, or somebody that is very well versed in that religion, may say this religion does not prohibit vaccines.
Right.
But a person who practices that faith or that belief system may say, my personal religious belief is different from what the head of my church or the head of my religion is saying. So it's very important for employers to, I think, look two places. Look at that religious EEOC, religious garb and dress, because it really lays that out. But also there's a guidance that was updated, I think in May, that talks about the ADA and religious accommodation and vaccines. So it has some helpful questions on this topic. So looking at those EEOC educational documents to really help get a good foundation is, I think, a good place for employers to start. And then that helps figure out, okay, we're not just, if the Pope says it's okay, then everybody who says they're Catholic has to get the vaccine. You have to understand that that's not exactly the way this is going to work.
Okay.
Then you need to know what you're going to ask, what you can ask. And as
Right.
I mentioned, there's some templates that have been put out. And I think there are a lot of employers who are willing to share what they're doing. And I think you could go online and find universities and healthcare institutions have just published these documents. But the Federal Workforce Task Force has put out these templates with a lot of good questions. So those templates have a kind of a list of questions that include things like, what is your religious belief and how does it conflict with getting the vaccine, and how long have you been practicing this? Basically trying to get to the sincerely held part.
Right.
The problem becomes that the EEOC has said pre-COVID that employers really shouldn't be getting into questions about whether somebody's religious belief is sincerely held. If somebody
Right.
says it, you should believe it. Now, that's not where we are today, because many people are, there are some people who are refusing the vaccine for different reasons,
Right.
and couching it as, a firmly held religious belief. So there is, there's three camps. There's the employers that are saying, we're not taking any exemption requests. We're going to deny every single one. I do know that on Sunday of this week, in Massachusetts, employees at Mass General Brigham have filed a complaint because most of the exemptions were denied.
Oh,
And so there are some employers that are denying exemptions kind of as a matter of course. And now we've got at least one lawsuit that is challenging that. There
mhm.
are some employers that are saying, I don't want to get into this. I don't want to know. And if you say you need an exemption, we're going to give it. I think the healthcare space is particularly difficult.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because that is where, what if you give this exemption to somebody and then they are unvaccinated and they come into your workplace and they have a surge in your workplace of, a place where people are very vulnerable and very exposed. So I think it's the way that the reasonable accommodation process is supposed to work is for employers to, get information that they need to evaluate whether it's a reasonable accommodation. And if they have doubts about the sincerity of what they're being given, they can ask for follow-up information.
Okay.
I know in the ones that I've been reviewing over the past several weeks, some people have filled out the form and also provided a letter from a religious figure, just to sort of make sure that it's very clear and to
Mhm.
show the sincerity of it. And, some people are just saying, this is my belief, but not really providing any details as to how long they've held that belief or why that belief, conflicts. And some are very clearly either politically or personally motivated and motivated by an objection to be forced to do something.
Right.
And
My
that is
body, my decision kind of
exactly
thing.
right. The government
Mhm.
can't tell me what to
Yeah.
do, and the government can't get my job, taken away from me. But this, so it's very important for employers to kind of differentiate those two, and so they can
Mhm.
get information from the EEOC. They can get information from the employee. They might ask the employee for some more information, and then they have to look at, if we give this exemption, is there an undue hardship?
Right.
What do we do if we give this exemption? If we give this exemption, is it enough to send the employee for testing? If we give this exemption, can we continue to use the full regalia, PPE, mask, face mask,
Mhm.
everything else, and still have this person come in? If we give this exemption, should this employee work at home? Right?
Right, right.
Is that the reasonable accommodation?
And if they work at home, well, they still have to go for testing.
Right. And so this is all where, I mean,
We don't know.
we don't know. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
if we're talking about 100 or more employees, a private employer with 100 or more employees, and the mandate is your workers must be vaccinated. You must have 100% vaccination or religious or medical exemptions, and all of those people must be vaccinated or have an exemption, then the remote workers would be included in that, right? Whether
Mhm.
they work at home or not. So
Right, right.
it's going to come down to the language of the ETS and where all that fits.
Okay, okay. And how about now with the addition of boosters and so forth?
Right.
Do you think that's possibly part of the holdup, is they're trying to decide whether they address the need for boosters too, if you fall into one of the categories where they suggest you get the booster in addition
Yeah.
to fully
Right.
vaccination, or will that be separate later? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so when I talked about the coordination that has to happen, OSHA might be working, we know they're working with CMS to deal with whatever the CMS guidance is going to be for healthcare, any organizations that receive funding from Medicare or Medicaid. But I would expect they're also coordinating with the CDC. And right now, the CDC's definition of fully vaccinated is you get the 1 or the 2 shots and you wait 2 weeks. That's currently the definition of fully vaccinated.
Mhm.
So I think until that definition changes, that the ETS is not going to say it's also boosters, but the ETS could piggyback and say, if the CDC changes it to be in order to be fully vaccinated, you have to have the booster. I think that's going to be incorporated into the ETS. Again,
Okay.
that's
Okay.
a guess, but that's,
Yep.
that's what we've been, you can't, you got to keep up with the science. I think that's what employers are continuing to have to do. And I think there has to be a little bit of wiggle room in all of this to understand that things are going to change. And it's not only the boosters, but some people will soon be coming up on a year that they've actually had, just the one shot. And so is this going to be a yearly exercise?
In addition to the other annual flu shots that are going on right now as well.
Right.
Yeah. A lot to keep track of.
Yes, exactly.
Well, what do you suggest also then in terms of what a company does relative to communicating to their employees what's going to happen if they refuse to either get vaccinated, they refuse to get tested, or put them on a warning, give them an extension, fire them? What do you recommend?
Well, I think some of this will be dictated by the ETS, right? Can they, because employers, we don't have a lot of detail about what fines could be or anything like that, but obviously employers have a lot of incentive to make sure that people comply.
Right.
And so we're going to just have to wait and see what they say about exemptions, what they say about testing, what they say about the size of the employer. All of this comes together, and it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks once we get all this. But I think there's a lot of policies that employers can kind of be thinking about, and discipline is one of them. How does this fit into the disciplinary and the code of conduct and that sort of thing? And some employers may have the ability to, again, we don't know about the remote worker situation. Like, do remote workers 100% need to be vaccinated? We could argue that healthcare workers are in a different camp from a lot of other professional services where there's maybe no interaction, or if the employee attests they won't have any interaction, they won't come on site, they won't go to client meetings, they won't go to networking events, they won't have any contact with their employee hat on with anybody in the workplace. That's hard to guarantee, but
sure is.
I think it then becomes a question of what can the employer withstand? Can they actually say we're firing everybody who's not vaccinated, or do they have opportunities for remote work as a reasonable accommodation?
Remote work as a reasonable accommodation. Sure.
Right.
Okay, well, we have about 10 minutes left, so let's take a look at some of the questions that have come in here. When an injunction is filed, will the legal advice to employers be to continue enforcing the mandate or suspend until final judgment is made?
I think it's going to depend on what the injunction is and really the basis for it. The Arizona litigation that's been filed says, and seems to be a politically based lawsuit. It says that undocumented individuals coming into the United States don't have a vaccination requirement, but employees of private employers will have a vaccination requirement, and therefore there's equal protection argument. You're treating two groups of people in this country differently. So I think we're going to need to look at the motivation and what is actually being litigated and what the injunction actually says, and also whether it's a nationwide injunction or just pertains to a certain group, before we know that. But I think, as I said earlier, some employers who have been looking for a way to require employees to increase the vaccination percentages in their workforce may use this as an opportunity to say, okay, that ETS came out, it's been challenged, but we think it could be undone, so we want to go ahead. So some employers may use that as an opportunity to just continue to pressure employees.
Got it. Okay. Let me see here. Let's see what else we got here. We got quite a few here. Are federal contractors allowed to test out of the executive order or vaccination only?
I don't believe so. I'm looking more at, yeah, I don't believe so.
Okay. Are federal contractors required to meet the requirements of the executive order prior to it being reflected in the contract? Like CDC guidance for masking and physical distancing?
Yeah, the federal contractor, that's a very in-depth, and I've gone into some depth with some of my employers, but the majority of my employer clients are not federal contractors, so I dove into it for various specific issues, and I haven't studied that as much as I have both the healthcare and then all the predictive work I've done on the 100 plus employers. So the federal
Okay.
worker one is one I would need a little bit more time to delve into it to answer those specific questions.
And there's a question about if you're vaccinated, will you have to be tested anyway, since there is some data showing that there are breakthrough infections?
Right. I don't, the way that I've understood what the Biden mandate was that it was directed to unvaccinated. But I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me that they would, if they were going to say testing for everybody, then they wouldn't do a vaccine mandate, in my view.
Okay. Okay. Got it. How does segregating people from a company event based on medical status pass the discrimination test?
I think on the basis of a direct health to safety. So there are, when you're doing a reasonable accommodation analysis, you can say, we can provide you a reasonable accommodation. And the accommodation will be that you either work from home or you come in and you wear your mask and you wear your face, your face shield and your mask, and you disinfect, and you don't eat in a room with other people, and you socially distance. So there's a lot of different conditions that employers can put down. And one of them could be, we need to protect the health and safety. Somebody who is unvaccinated, that the theory goes that somebody who is unvaccinated is a direct threat to the health and safety of others. So where you have that direct threat to health and safety, you can impose some of those additional conditions.
You can, okay. How would unemployment be decided for employees who refuse to vaccinate and quit their jobs?
Yeah, I think that's gonna be a state by state analysis, first of all, because unemployment is, but obviously we've seen some states during the height of the pandemic that were saying, if you leave work for any reason related to the pandemic, those people got unemployment. On the other hand, I know, and I practice largely in Massachusetts, with a good amount of work also in New Hampshire. And for Massachusetts, the standard is, if you leave work through no fault of your own, you would be entitled to unemployment. And so the question is going to become, is it really no fault of your own if you are terminated because you refuse to get vaccinated?
Right.
And people would say, well, there's no fault of my own because I have a religious or medical reason, and they wouldn't give me an accommodation, or the accommodation they gave me was, unworkable. So, that's going to be where the dispute lies, I think. And there probably will be some sort of pronouncement, as we kind of weave through this to find out, is leaving work through no fault of your own. And there was a very interesting set of FAQs that came under the FFCRA, right? The FFCRA provided paid leave with tax credits, but it didn't provide paid leave to people that were also on unemployment. And there was in some of the later questions and answers that were issued, the Department of Labor addressed this head on and said, is it your fault that you left because of various things happening, like because your child care was closed, or because your workplace was closed? And so I would hope that OSHA would take the same type of rigorous review in their FAQs that under the FFCRA. There were something like over 100 questions, or close to 100 questions.
Oh yeah.
So,
They went on and on, and then they would add on to them.
right,
Every
which
few
is
days, right?
very, very helpful for employers, right?
Yeah, you just had to really pay attention there for sure. Does the religious exemption apply to healthcare workers also? Can they have religious exemptions if they're healthcare?
That actually may be a function of state law as well. My understanding, and I don't practice a lot in Maine, but my understanding was that a recent Maine pronouncement relating to healthcare workers only said a medical exemption.
Right, right. It
not
did.
religious.
You're right about that. Mhm.
So
we saw that.
Right.
Right. So that may be state by state is what you're saying. Sure.
Right. Although the healthcare ETS does mention religious accommodation. If that's helpful.
Okay. And there, can you explain the foreign exemption more fully?
The what?
The foreign exemption? Like if you have people that work in a foreign country that are working for you, that they will be counted?
Well, it's unclear to me what, I
Yeah.
mean, we don't know. At this point, we do
We don't
not know. I'm just saying that if you look at some of the, definitions that have been used in other healthcare or other employment laws recently.
Right.
For example, the FFCRA defined it as part-time, full-time employees in the United States.
And is
So-
part-time covered temporary as well?
Right,
If you,
right.
It does.
Yep, seasonal, yep,
Okay.
right. Yeah, so again, we
Okay.
don't know that. It could be the reason that the FFCRA was only relating to US employees is because there was a US tax credit. I mean,
Mhm.
that might be a reason. So we don't know
Yeah.
at this point
Yeah.
how that's. gonna be
If you have a position that, one of the accommodation that they can't work from home, they're either on the line, the manufacturer, they're a teacher or something. Does that mean that they can deny it to that employee?
So they could, if you have a request for an accommodation, they could find that it's reasonable to accommodate, right? You have a basis, you've given us the information that we need, and there's a reasonable accommodation. The request for accommodation is a reasonable one, but that it's an undue hardship for us to continue to employ you because
Mhm.
you need to be on the line, and there's no way that we can have you effectively teach a class
Right.
when the whole class is in the room and all the kindergartners are running around and you're teaching from your living room. And you can't, do manufacturing work from your place of your residence. So that would be definitely, fall in the undue hardship if there's really no way that they can work remotely.
Okay. Okay, well, we've reached the end of the hour here today. Thank you, Karen. Really appreciate you being with us. You've really, answered a ton of questions here, and they're going to continue to come. We have recorded today's session, and we'll be putting this on our kmahr.com website probably later today, if you want to take a look back at some of these things. And if I see any other questions come in, then we'll get those answered as well. Again, there is a SHRM credit for this. If you want that, please reach out to me at rhoda@kmahr.com, and I'll get that information to you. But Karen, thank you so much for being with us today and using what you could see in your crystal ball so far.
My very foggy crystal ball, right?
That's okay. But we shall see what happens, and maybe by this time next week we'll have even more questions. Who knows? But thank you all of you for tuning in today. Hope you all learned something, and thank you, Karen. Again, this was very helpful.
Very glad to join you. I hope everybody has a great day, and I hope that at 1:02 p.m. we don't see the ETS because you can then forget everything you just heard, right?
There you go. Or validate what you just heard.
Well, hopefully that will be the case. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you again. Have a great week, everyone.
Thanks.